On a quiet Monday morning, Ethan Walker stepped out onto the porch of his farmhouse and stopped exactly where he stood. The side of his barn, the same barn his grandfather had built with his own hands more than 60 years earlier, had been painted overnight in a blinding coat of white. Across the wood, in letters taller than a grown man, someone had written the words HOA, approved barn color. No one had asked his permission. No one had called. No letter had ever arrived warning him this would happen, and no notice had ever been posted on his gate. The only evidence of what had taken place was a small security camera mounted above his workshop door, quietly recording everything from a distance, including the exact moment the president of the Homeowners Association walked onto his land at 2 a.m. with 2 other people and a compressor sprayer, moving across his grass, as if the property already belonged to her. Patricia Collins believed that morning that Ethan would simply accept what had happened, the way she assumed most people eventually accepted the authority of her association without question. But by the following morning, when a survey crew arrived and began driving new boundary stakes into the earth, according to a 40-year-old county record, Patricia would come to understand that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her life, one that would unravel far more than a single dispute over paint. Ethan Walker was 52 years old, a retired civil engineer, who had spent nearly 30 years designing infrastructure before returning home to run the farm his family had held for 4 generations. He lived alone, worked with his hands from sunrise most mornings, and rarely raised his voice at anyone, even when provoked. He understood something most of his neighbors did not, which was exactly where the law began and where it ended. And he had learned, across decades of contracts, permits, and blueprints, that paper always outlasted opinion in the end. The barn behind his house was more than a structure to him. It was deep red, weathered by generations of seasons, and it had stood on that land since long before the county had ever paved the narrow road leading to it. It was the one thing on the property that still looked exactly the way his grandfather had left it, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as he lived. The Homeowners Association surrounding his land was still relatively new, formed only a handful of years earlier when a developer purchased and subdivided several lots at the edge of Ethan's property, building a cluster of matching houses with matching lawns and matching mailboxes along a single curving street. Patricia Collins had been voted president almost immediately after the association's formation, largely because she was the loudest voice in the room during those early meetings and the only one willing to spend her evenings reading through pages of bylaws that most residents never bothered to open. She believed, sincerely and without much room for argument, that a neighborhood only carried value if everything within it appeared uniform, and she treated every fence post, every mailbox, and every blade of grass within sight of the entrance as something that belonged, at least in spirit, to the association she led. It did not take long before the first letters began arriving at Ethan's mailbox. At first it was the color of his fence, which the association claimed did not match an approved palette, despite the fence standing entirely on his own property, well outside any boundary the association actually controlled. Then it was his mailbox, described in a formal notice as outdated and inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Then his lawn, cited in another letter for exceeding a maximum permitted height by nearly 2 inches, measured apparently by someone standing at the edge of the road with a tape measure. Then, finally, his barn roof, which Patricia insisted violated a shared visual standard that had, in truth, never actually been written into any binding document the association could legally enforce. Each time a letter arrived, Ethan responded the same way, calmly and without emotion, sending back copies of his property deed, direct quotes from the original recorded covenant, and a polite but firm reminder that his land had never fallen under the association's jurisdiction to begin with. There had been other moments too, smaller ones that never made it into any official letter but that lingered in the memory of everyone who witnessed them. Once, during a community cookout held near the entrance sign, Patricia had stood in front of a small crowd and joked that certain properties along the edge of the neighborhood dragged down everyone else's home values, glancing pointedly toward Ethan's barn as she said it. He had simply smiled, thanked her for the burger someone handed him, and walked back to his truck without a word of protest. Another time, a member of the landscaping crew Patricia had hired to maintain the community entrance wandered onto Ethan's grass with a trimmer, insisting he had been told the flower bed extended that far. Ethan had asked him politely to stop, then spent that same afternoon quietly photographing the exact spot where the flower bed sat, tucking the photographs into the same growing folder he kept in his study without telling anyone why. Patricia despised this pattern more than she would ever admit out loud. She had grown accustomed to homeowners who folded the moment they received an official-looking envelope, assuming, as most people did, that the association carried more authority than it actually possessed on paper. Ethan was different, and that difference unsettled her. He answered every notice with documentation instead of apology, and something about his composure irritated her far more than open defiance ever could have. Where other residents grew flustered or apologetic, Ethan simply filed each letter away in a folder he kept in his study, adding it to a growing stack he never once mentioned to anyone. By late spring, Patricia's irritation had curdled into something closer to obsession, and at the end of one particularly heated board meeting, held in the community clubhouse under fluorescent lighting, the association issued its final and most aggressive notice yet. The barn, they declared, needed to be repainted white within 7 days, in accordance with what they described as the neighborhood's unified exterior standard, a phrase that appeared nowhere in any document Ethan had ever been shown. Ethan read the letter twice at his kitchen table, then set it down beside his coffee without any visible reaction. He had no intention of painting a barn that had stood untouched for decades, simply because a small committee with no legal claim to his land had decided it clashed with their preferred vision of the street. He called the association's office the following morning, and calmly informed the woman who answered that the barn fell entirely outside their boundary and their authority, a fact confirmed within the hour by his attorney, a soft-spoken but formidable man named Daniel Ross, who had represented land disputes throughout the county for over 20 years. Daniel reviewed the original property records that afternoon and told Ethan plainly, without hesitation, that the homeowners association held no legal standing whatsoever over any structure on his land, and never had. Patricia did not accept this answer easily. She called an emergency meeting of the board that same evening, gathering only a small circle of loyal members inside her own living room rather than the clubhouse, choosing privacy over procedure. Linda Brooks, a board member who had never once disagreed with Patricia on anything of consequence, sat beside her taking notes, nodding along as Patricia paced the room describing Ethan as a man who believed the rules simply did not apply to him. It was Linda, somewhere near the end of the second hour, who eventually suggested the idea that would come to change everything that followed. If Ethan refused to comply willingly, she reasoned, they could simply act first and explain themselves afterward, framing the decision later as a well-intentioned improvement rather than anything resembling a violation. Patricia liked the suggestion immediately, and something in her expression relaxed for the first time in days. She had grown tired of being told no by a man who always seemed one step ahead of her in every exchange, and she wanted, more than almost anything else, to prove to herself and to the board that her authority over the neighborhood was real and absolute. 2 nights later, under cover of darkness, a pickup truck bearing the Homeowners Association logo rolled quietly onto the gravel road beside Ethan's property, its headlights switched off well before it reached the fence line. Patricia stepped out first, followed closely by Linda and one association maintenance employee carrying a compressor sprayer already loaded with white exterior paint. They crossed onto Ethan's land without hesitation, climbing over a low section of split-rail fence near the barn's east wall, moving quickly and quietly across the wet grass. Within minutes, the sprayer was running, coating the deep red wood in a flat, ghostly white that seemed almost to glow under the moonlight. Before leaving, Patricia herself took a brush from the truck bed and painted the words HOA-approved barn color across the largest section of the wall in careful block lettering, stepping back afterward to admire her work in the glow of a handheld flashlight as if she had just completed something noble rather than something criminal. None of them noticed the small camera mounted beneath the workshop eave, its lens angled directly at the barn, recording every second of what would later become the centerpiece of Patricia's undoing. By sunrise, word had already begun to spread along the narrow stretch of road connecting the farm to the subdivision, carried mostly by a jogger who had slowed her pace to stare at the strange white letters glowing against the early light. A handful of neighbors gathered near the fence line within the hour, murmuring among themselves, some laughing nervously, others simply confused about what they were looking at. Ethan walked out onto his porch, coffee in hand, and simply stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight without a trace of panic or outrage crossing his face. When Mark Henderson, a neighbor who had always tried to stay carefully neutral in the ongoing disputes between Ethan and the association, asked whether he intended to call the police right away, Ethan only shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the barn. He did not shout. He did not storm toward the association office demanding immediate answers or restitution. Instead, a slow, quiet smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that unsettled the small crowd watching him far more than any outburst ever could have. He finished his coffee at his own pace, set the empty mug down carefully on the porch railing, and told Mark, without a hint of urgency, that he had a few phone calls to make before the day got any further along. The first call Ethan made that morning was not to the police, though the footage from his camera would eventually reach them as well, in time. Instead, he called Michael Grant, a licensed land surveyor he had worked with years earlier during a separate dispute involving an old irrigation line that ran along the northern edge of the county. Michael was 63, precise in his speech, and known throughout the region for his meticulous attention to old records that most people had long since forgotten even existed in the archives. Ethan asked him to pull every historical survey ever filed for the property, going back as far as the county's records allowed, and to bring whatever equipment he needed to walk the full boundary in person. His second call went to Daniel Ross, who listened without interruption as Ethan described the events of the previous night in careful, measured detail. Daniel asked only one question before agreeing to take the matter further, wanting to know whether Ethan had any video evidence of what had occurred. When Ethan confirmed the camera had captured the entire incident from start to finish, Daniel's tone shifted slightly, taking on the careful calm of a man who already sensed the situation had grown into something far larger than a simple disagreement over paint color and property aesthetics. Before making that third call, Ethan spent nearly an hour walking the fence line himself, camera in hand, photographing every post, every marker, and every place where the association's landscaping crept closer to his barn than he remembered it ever being in his father's time. He had grown up on this land, had spent entire summers as a boy helping his grandfather mend fences and clear brush along the same boundary now in question, and something about the memory of those years made the theft of the previous night feel even more personal than the paint itself. It was not simply about a wall being defaced, he realized standing there in the early light. It was about a line his family had respected for generations being casually erased overnight by people who had never once bothered to learn its history. His third call went directly to the county recorder's office, where he requested certified copies of every plat map and boundary filing associated with both his property and the neighboring subdivision, going back through every recorded transaction. It was during this call that a clerk mentioned, almost as an afterthought while flipping through old ledgers, that the association's development had originally been surveyed using an outdated reference point tied to a filing dated 1984, one that had, as far as the clerk could tell, never been formally updated when the newer subdivision was built years later. Ethan wrote the date down carefully on a legal pad and underlined it twice, a small gesture that would later prove far more significant than either he or the clerk could have imagined that morning. Over the following days, Ethan worked with the quiet discipline of a man assembling a case rather than fighting a war out of anger. He gathered deeds, historical tax records, easement agreements, and old aerial photographs, laying them out across his kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle, only he seemed capable of understanding at first glance. He did not respond to any further letters from the association, nor did he engage with the growing whispers now circulating through the neighborhood about the painted barn and the strange calm with which he had received it. Patricia, for her part, assumed his silence meant defeat, and she told Linda more than once, with visible satisfaction, that Ethan had clearly realized he could not win against the full weight of the association's collective authority. She could not have been more mistaken about the man she was dealing with. Michael Grant arrived at the farm 8 days after the incident, carrying rolled survey maps under one arm and a tablet loaded with satellite overlays under the other, along with a truck full of surveying equipment he had not needed to use in years for a case this promising. He spent the better part of 2 full days walking the property line with a total station and a set of coordinates pulled directly from the county's original 1984 filing, cross-referencing every marker against the boundary the subdivision currently assumed to be accurate. Ethan watched from a respectful distance most of the time, occasionally offering a detail about a fence post his grandfather had once mentioned in passing, or an old irrigation ditch that had not been disturbed in decades, details that helped Michael orient his instruments against the landscape's older history. Throughout those 2 days, Michael worked with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that boundary disputes were rarely settled by instinct or memory, only by numbers pulled from records no one thought to question. He cross-referenced the 1984 coordinates against modern satellite positioning, checked them again against an older paper survey stored in a filing cabinet at the county office, and walked the physical ground a third time with a metal detector to locate the original iron markers buried beneath decades of grass and topsoil. When he finally found one of those markers, rusted but intact, exactly where the old paperwork said it should be, he called Ethan over and knelt beside it in the dirt, brushing away the soil with careful fingers as though uncovering something far older than a simple property stake. It was, in its own quiet way, proof that the land itself had never forgotten where it truly began and ended, even after everyone living beside it had. On the second afternoon, Michael finally straightened up from his equipment, pulled off his cap, wiped his forehead, and walked toward Ethan with an expression that mixed genuine disbelief with something close to quiet professional excitement. There was something interesting Ethan needed to know, he said, something he doubted anyone currently living in the subdivision had ever bothered to check for themselves. According to Michael's findings, the boundary line the homeowners association had relied upon for every decision since its formation, including the placement of its own entrance sign, a section of decorative fencing along the community road, several security cameras, and even a small flower bed near the community mailboxes, was incorrect by nearly 8 feet along its entire length. The original 1984 survey placed the true property line significantly farther into what the association had long considered its own common area, meaning a strip of land the neighborhood had casually treated as shared property for years, actually belonged, and had always belonged, entirely to Ethan. It was not a minor discrepancy that could be waved away with an apology or a small adjustment. The association's internal road, the very one residents used every single day to reach their driveways, ran directly over a portion of Ethan's land for a considerable stretch. The ornamental sign bearing the neighborhood's name sat squarely inside his boundary, its concrete base poured years earlier without anyone checking a single record. Even one of the security cameras Patricia had proudly installed to monitor the entrance was, according to the county's own historical record, mounted on a pole standing on property that had never belonged to the association at all, a detail that struck Ethan as almost poetic, given everything that had happened. Michael explained, in his usual measured and unhurried tone, that if Ethan chose to formally reassert the boundary according to the original filing, he would be entitled to reclaim every inch of that disputed land, along with everything currently built upon it, without needing to compensate anyone for the structures involved. Ethan considered this for a long moment, staring out toward the fence line where the discrepancy had quietly existed for years, without a single person noticing or questioning it. He told Michael that he had no interest in taking anything that was not rightfully his to begin with, nor did he want revenge simply for the satisfaction of it. What he wanted, he said, was for everything to finally be correct, exactly as the law and the original records had always intended it to be, nothing more and nothing less. With Michael's survey complete, signed, and formally notarized, Ethan and Daniel Ross filed the necessary paperwork with the county to officially reestablish the original property boundary, according to the 1984 record. The process moved faster than either of them had expected, largely because the original filing was airtight and predated the subdivision itself by years, carrying full legal precedence over any assumptions the homeowners association had made in the time since its formation. Within a matter of weeks, the county reviewed and approved the updated boundary, and a small crew was dispatched to drive fresh survey stakes into the ground exactly where the original record indicated they had always belonged. A formal notice was mailed to the homeowners association informing them of the boundary correction and requesting, politely but firmly, that any structures currently encroaching on Ethan's land be removed within a reasonable time frame set by the county. Patricia read the letter standing in her kitchen, and after a moment of stunned silence, she laughed out loud, convinced entirely that Ethan was attempting some kind of elaborate bluff meant to intimidate her into abandoning the original barn dispute altogether. She told Linda later that same evening, over the phone, that a man like Ethan could posture with paperwork all he wanted, but no one was ever going to move a community sign over a strip of ordinary grass that had sat untouched for years. Her confidence did not survive the following morning. Ethan arrived at sunrise with a small excavator he had rented from a contractor 2 towns over, along with a crew of 2 men he trusted deeply from his years working in construction and civil engineering. Without fanfare or announcement, they began carefully removing the section of decorative fencing that crossed onto his land, followed by the flower bed, and finally the pole holding one of the association's security cameras, each piece lifted and set aside with the same careful precision Ethan applied to everything he did. In their place, they planted a row of fresh survey stakes and a single sign, simple and unmistakable, reading private property along the newly corrected boundary line for anyone traveling the road to see clearly. Patricia arrived within the hour, alerted by a frantic phone call from a resident who had seen the excavator working steadily near the community entrance. She stood at the edge of the disturbed grass, watching in growing disbelief as pieces of what she still considered association property were lifted away and stacked neatly along Ethan's side of the new boundary line. For the first time since the entire dispute had begun months earlier, something in her expression shifted from irritation into something closer to genuine alarm. Patricia demanded that the work stop immediately, insisting loudly that Ethan had no legal right to touch anything belonging to the neighborhood as a whole. Ethan, standing calmly near the excavator with a folder tucked under one arm, handed her a copy of the county's approval letter along with the certified survey documents, waiting patiently while she read through them. He explained, without ever raising his voice, that the boundary correction had already been thoroughly reviewed and formally accepted by the county, and that everything currently being removed sat legally on his own property, according to a record older and more authoritative than the subdivision itself. Patricia refused to accept this at face value and called the association's own attorney to the site within the hour, confident that a proper legal review would ultimately expose Ethan's claim as either an exaggeration or a simple misunderstanding of the paperwork involved. The attorney arrived carrying his own set of documents, prepared to argue firmly on the association's behalf. But as he reviewed Ethan's paperwork line by line, standing there in the morning sun, his expression gradually shifted from professional confidence to quiet, mounting concern. He compared the 1984 filing against the association's original development plans and found, with growing discomfort, that Ethan's claim was not only legitimate but entirely airtight from a legal standpoint. After several long minutes of silence, the attorney finally turned toward Patricia and told her plainly, in a tone that left no room for argument, that they had a serious problem on their hands. The boundary correction was valid, the encroachments were real and well documented, and the association had no legal ground whatsoever to dispute any part of it. Patricia's face went pale as the full weight of the situation settled over her, and for the first time since the barn had been painted, she said absolutely nothing at all, standing silently among the stacked fence sections she had once believed belonged entirely to her association. The board called an emergency meeting that same evening, though this time the mood inside Patricia's living room was far different from the confident energy of the night they had decided to paint the barn without asking. Several members who had previously supported her without question now sat with their arms crossed, asking pointed and uncomfortable questions about how she could have allowed the situation to spiral this far without ever consulting anyone outside her small inner circle of loyal supporters. Linda, sensing the shift in the room almost immediately, quietly began distancing herself from the plan she had once championed so enthusiastically, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had only meant it as a passing suggestion and had never expected Patricia to act on it so literally and so recklessly. As the meeting wore on late into the night, accusations began to surface that Patricia had made numerous decisions over the years without proper board approval, using her position more as a form of personal authority than as part of any genuine collective leadership. Old grievances that residents had quietly carried for years, about spending decisions, about selective enforcement of rules, about favoritism shown to certain families, suddenly resurfaced all at once. What had started as a simple dispute over a barn's paint color had, within the span of little more than a week, exposed years of unchecked decisions that many residents had simply never felt empowered to question before that morning. Within a week, Ethan's security footage from the night of the incident found its way into the hands of the county sheriff's department, submitted formally through Daniel Ross as part of the growing legal case against the association and its leadership. The footage left no room whatsoever for interpretation or excuse. It showed Patricia directing the entire operation with clear and deliberate authority, Linda holding the paint roller while offering instructions of her own, and an association employee climbing over Ethan's fence, carrying equipment that never belonged to any of them. Daniel explained carefully to Ethan, and later to investigators reviewing the case, that the footage documented several distinct violations of law, including trespassing, property damage, and criminal mischief, each of which carried its own separate legal consequences under state statute. Beyond the incident itself, the newly corrected boundary survey had exposed something far larger and more consequential than anyone involved had originally anticipated. For years, the association had been quietly operating under the false assumption that a significant strip of land belonged to them collectively, using it for shared infrastructure, decorative landscaping, and even portions of the community's main entrance road, all without a single person ever bothering to verify the original property records against reality. As word of this spread steadily through the neighborhood in the days that followed, residents who had once trusted Patricia's leadership without question began demanding real answers about what else may have been mismanaged or misrepresented during her years as president of the board. The independent audit, once it began in earnest, took nearly 3 weeks to complete, conducted by a small accounting firm from the county seat that had no prior connection to anyone on the board. What it uncovered went well beyond the boundary dispute that had triggered it in the first place. The auditors found that association dues collected over several years had been used to cover a handful of expenses never approved by any formal vote, including a portion of the cost for the very entrance sign that had been sitting illegally on Ethan's land the entire time. They found invoices for landscaping work billed at rates well above market value, paid to a company that, as it turned out, was owned by a relative of Linda's husband. None of it amounted to anything as dramatic as outright theft, the auditors were careful to note, but taken together it painted a picture of a small organization that had grown used to operating without real oversight, trusting its leadership simply because no one had ever thought to ask for the receipts. A general meeting was called soon after, open to every homeowner within the association, and residents arrived in numbers no one had ever expected to see at a routine community gathering. Over 100 people filled the small community hall that evening, far more than had ever attended a single meeting since the neighborhood's founding years earlier. Word of the painted barn, the falsified boundary, and the damning surveillance footage had traveled quickly through every street and driveway, and simple curiosity alone was enough to fill every available seat in the room well before the meeting had even officially begun. Patricia stood at the front of the hall under the same fluorescent lighting that had witnessed so many of her earlier decisions, attempting to explain her actions as an effort made purely for the good of the neighborhood as a whole, insisting repeatedly that she had only ever wanted the community to look more unified and more presentable to visitors and prospective buyers alike. Her voice wavered noticeably as she spoke. The confidence that had once defined nearly every public appearance she made, now conspicuously absent from every word she offered. Ethan, seated quietly near the back of the room, did not interrupt her once. He waited patiently until she had finished speaking before rising to address the crowd himself, carrying with him a single folder containing the security footage on a small drive, the certified survey documents, the original recorded covenant, and meeting minutes proving that several of the association's past decisions had never been properly authorized by the full board to begin with. As Ethan presented each piece of evidence calmly and methodically, one item at a time, the mood in the room shifted decisively and unmistakably. Neighbors who had once assumed Patricia's authority was essentially absolute now saw, laid out plainly and undeniably before them, just how far that authority had actually been stretched beyond its true and documented limits over the years. A few residents tried, briefly, to argue that Patricia's intentions had at least been good, that the whole ordeal had simply gotten out of hand rather than being born from any real malice. But when Daniel Ross, invited to speak on Ethan's behalf, calmly explained that intent did not change the legal weight of trespassing, property damage, or the misuse of association funds, even those last remaining defenders grew quiet. One elderly resident near the front, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood since its earliest days, stood up and said simply that she had trusted Patricia because no one had ever given her a reason not to, and that trust, once broken this way, was not something a single apology could repair. Her words seemed to settle over the room more heavily than anything Ethan himself had said all evening. By the end of the presentation, very few people remaining in the room seemed willing to defend her position any longer. A vote was called almost immediately afterward, and by an overwhelming and decisive majority, the residents removed Patricia from her position as president that same evening, along with a formal decision to launch an independent financial audit of the association's records, dating all the way back to its original founding. In the weeks that followed, the full financial and legal consequences of the incident continued to take shape steadily. Patricia was formally required, through a legal settlement negotiated by Daniel Ross, to cover the entire cost of professionally restoring Ethan's barn to its original condition, along with the fees for the survey work that had ultimately exposed the boundary error at the heart of everything. She was also held responsible for the legal costs Ethan had personally incurred throughout the process, in addition to further damages tied directly to the trespassing and property destruction so clearly captured on his camera that night. The association itself, separately, was ordered to relocate every structure still encroaching on Ethan's newly confirmed property line, including the entrance sign, the remaining sections of fencing, and the surveillance camera that had, somewhat ironically, never once captured any footage of anything happening on the correct side of the actual boundary. Despite everything he had personally endured throughout the ordeal, Ethan never once pushed for anything beyond what he considered genuinely fair under the circumstances. When Daniel suggested pursuing additional damages related to emotional distress or lasting reputational harm, damages that many attorneys would have considered entirely reasonable given the footage, Ethan declined without much deliberation, telling him quietly that he had no real interest in profiting further from the situation beyond what had already been made right. All he truly wanted, he explained one evening on his porch, was for the boundary to be permanently respected and for the barn to be returned to what it had always represented for his family. When Patricia, humbled and visibly shaken by everything that had unfolded, eventually asked him directly what more he expected from her going forward, Ethan offered only one simple and quiet request in return, delivered without any trace of anger or lingering resentment. He asked simply that she never step onto his land again for the rest of her life. By late summer, the barn had been fully restored to its former glory, its walls repainted in the same deep red that had marked the property for generations of Walker family history, with every trace of the white paint and the association's slogan carefully sanded away and replaced through professional restoration work paid for entirely by Patricia under the terms of the settlement. Ethan built a new wooden fence exactly along the boundary confirmed by the county surveyors, using solid, weathered posts that echoed the same quiet craftsmanship his grandfather had once used, decades earlier when the original fence had first gone up. The Homeowners Association elected an entirely new set of leaders that autumn, a group far more cautious and far more committed to following proper legal procedure than the previous board had ever demonstrated during its short and troubled history. Their very first official act as a new board was a full and thorough revision of the community bylaws, ensuring every single rule going forward aligned strictly with actual legal authority rather than convenience or personal preference. Mark Henderson, who had watched the entire situation unfold quietly from the sidelines for months, stopped by Ethan's porch one evening that fall to thank him personally, admitting openly that Ethan's insistence on doing everything strictly by the book had likely spared the entire neighborhood from years of costly and divisive legal battles further down the road. Mark mentioned, almost in passing, that he had spoken with several other longtime residents who felt the same way, people who had quietly worried for years about the association's growing habit of treating suggestions as rules and rules as absolute law. None of them, he admitted, had ever felt equipped to challenge it themselves, not the way Ethan had, calmly and with the full weight of documented fact behind every word. Ethan only nodded at this, unwilling to take much credit for what he still considered a simple matter of defending what was rightfully his. He told Mark that he had never set out to reform the association or teach anyone a lesson about overreach, and that everything which followed had only ever been a natural consequence of people finally checking records that should have been checked years earlier. Still, he admitted, watching the new board conduct its first proper meeting the following week, with printed agendas and a hired parliamentarian keeping order, there was something quietly satisfying about seeing a system correct itself once the truth was finally allowed to surface. Linda Brooks remained in the neighborhood, though she quietly resigned from every committee she had once served on, choosing instead to keep to herself for the better part of a year. She sent Ethan a short note not long after the settlement was finalized, apologizing for her role in what had happened, and admitting that she had gone along with Patricia's plan that night without ever truly stopping to consider whether it was right. Ethan read the note once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where he kept the old letters from the association, not out of resentment, but simply because he had always been a man who kept records of everything that mattered. Patricia sold her home only a few months later, quietly and without much fanfare, moving away from the community she had once tried so hard to control and shape according to her own vision. Her reputation among her former neighbors had been permanently altered by everything that had come to light over those difficult weeks, and few people seemed particularly sorry to see her go when the moving truck finally pulled away from her driveway for the last time. Ethan, for his part, remained exactly where he had always been, tending steadily to his land through every changing season, walking the fence line each quiet morning, and watching the barn catch the early light just as it had for generations of his family before him. On a clear morning, not long after the new fence was finished, and the last of the survey stakes had been replaced with permanent markers, Ethan walked out to check the boundary one final time, the grass still damp beneath his boots from the previous night's rain. The barn stood tall behind him, its red paint glowing warmly under the rising sun, exactly as it had looked in every old photograph his family had ever carefully kept in a box beneath the stairs. Near the entrance to the property, a small wooden sign stood planted firmly in the earth, simple and entirely unmistakable in its quiet message to anyone who passed by on the road. It read, in plain lettering that needed no further explanation to anyone who understood what had happened there, "Private property. Respect begins at the boundary." And as the morning light spread slowly and steadily across the surrounding fields, the farm settled once again into the quiet, undisturbed rhythm it had always known throughout the generations, its borders finally, permanently, exactly where they had always been meant to be, respected at last by everyone who lived within sight of them. Years later, when new families moved into the subdivision and heard the story secondhand, most of them assumed it had grown taller in the retelling, the way local stories often do. They pictured a dramatic courtroom battle, or a shouting match at the fence line, something closer to the way conflict usually unfolds when pride and property collide. But those who had actually lived through it, who had stood in that community hall and watched Ethan lay out his evidence one folder at a time without ever once raising his voice, remembered it differently. They remembered a man who never needed to fight loudly because he had simply taken the time to be right, and who understood, long before anyone else in that neighborhood did, that the truth, once properly documented, rarely needed defending at all.